start? Yeah. Good morning, everyone. As the last people sit down, I guess all our speakers are here. So let's get started. Thank you very much for coming at these ungodly hours on the last day and after the party, where I've seen many of you last night. So we are particularly impressed with your dedication. So this section is entitled Datafication and Social Justice, What Challenges for Internet Governance? ? And we are going to have 8 speakers. We're going to speak roughly between 5 and 8 minutes each. I'm going to be trying to use this and enforce the time limit so that we can open the floor for discussion and interaction right afterwards. I'm going to briefly just introduce each speaker, but basically calling out their name and their affiliation. Feel free, each of you, to say something more about yourself. Just so that you know why on the slides there are 2 logos. This session is promoted, put together by 2 organizations, and actually a 3rd and 4th one as well. Those in the slides are Data Active, which is my research project at the University of Amsterdam. We study citizen engagement with massive data collection. There are some of the members here in the room. And the second group is Data Justice Lab at Cardiff University, which is, as the name says, concerned with data justice. And then we also have Vidushi Martha here from Article 19/Center for Internet and Society in Bangalore. So a lot of people. But without further ado, I would like to call upon Arne to give a short introduction to the title and the meaning of all of this.
Yeah, we thought before we get into our actual speakers that we have for today and our bigger roundtable, which is now really big. It's great to see many people here on the final day. We just set the stage a little bit and raise just some of the issues that we might discuss here over these 1.5 hours, and also maybe take up some time so that more people have the chance to come in over the next few minutes and to listen to our actual speakers who will start afterwards. But so we thought just to set the stage, to say a few words about what we're actually talking about here. The title is, of course, about datafication. Should we do that with the slides, or I don't know? It's a bit, we have to coordinate a little bit. We'll just have a few pictures just to wake us up in the morning, I guess. So what is datafication? It's the transformation of our lives and our social environment into data points, and it's also about the collection and analysis and use of that data. So the collection of data from social media and other forms of communications data, but also a vast range of other life data now these days, data about our health and body functions, data about our locations in smart homes and smart cities and so on. And from that, information is derived about our consumption habits, but also about our political preferences, our moods, our mental state, a variety of personal traits. And this means, in a way, and kind of this is maybe provocatively, I don't know, our starting point, that the internet has become a tool for monitoring and analyzing entire populations on a pretty unprecedented scale, and that our information infrastructure, and therefore also the infrastructure now of our daily life, has become an infrastructure for monitoring and arguably, maybe that's something to discuss, control. How is this data used, by whom and for what? Well, of course, from Edward Snowden's revelations, we know our state agencies collect and use data, and there are many new laws now, like in the UK, for example, the Investigatory Powers Act, that allow governments to officially and legally collect all our data, to track our browsing habits, to even hack into our devices, and so on. On the private sector side, there is a huge industry, as we know, that has emerged around buying and selling data. Detailed profiles of citizens are created by aggregating data from social media, from financial records, from health records, from online purchases, and so on. And through that, we are increasingly categorized, assessed, rated, ranked as consumers, but also increasingly as citizens. And we know this, of course, from financial credit scores, but increasingly also our non-financial and non-consumer data is being included in such scores, in such calculations. There are financial startups that utilize data from social media, from web searches, and so on, to calculate people's creditworthiness. This may include data on how you fill in an online form, or the grammar and punctuation of your text messages, or even the battery status of your phone. All these are data points that are, by some companies, now included in these kind of things. And of course then, not of course, but increasingly also data about your friends and social networks and so on. The most far-reaching project in that sense is planned by the Chinese government, and we'll maybe talk about this a bit later. But here the idea is then that, the idea of a financial credit score is expanded to a vast range of life decisions. So whether you get a job, whether you get better social services, access to good schools, and so on. But the principle is increasingly applied, we think, also in the West, whether it's for calculating the risk factor of migrants and refugees, or in the criminal justice system to set jail sentences and decide on bail, for example. And as we've learned from some of these investigations, like as you see on the slide, that's from investigation by ProPublica, data scores can also be discriminatory, and in this case, racist. And what this means is that data is increasingly collected about us, and we are constantly monitored, analyzed, and assessed. And our position in society and how we are treated, and the services that we have access to, and the ways in which we participate in society are all affected by this. And so that leads us then to a few questions like these. What are the implications of the increasing profiling and categorizing and scoring and ranking of people according to data sets? What are the implications for citizenship and for state-citizen relations, but also for democracy, participation, and the rule of law, for social justice more broadly, including political and economic justice, but given that we're here at the IGF, of course, also what are the implications for internet governance and for the IGF, perhaps? And then what should be done about this? At the policy level, do we need more limitations to data collection or to data use by government, for example? What can be done at the tech design level? That's probably not something that we'll focus on so much here, but nevertheless it's an important issue. But also more broadly at the level of society, is it time to connect issues of datafication and of digital rights much more with the broader social justice agenda? And these are just some thoughts that we had, and some that kind of made us want to think a bit further about all these issues here at the IGF, together with a great group of speakers. And so let's get going with this. Yeah?
So thank you very much, Arne, for the introduction. And I would like to call on Eva from Privacy International to go with the presentation. Thank you very much.
Sure. Should I turn this on, or Oh, great, thank you. Sorry about that. Hi, I'm Eva Bloom-Dumontet from Privacy International. We are a charity based in London. We work on fighting surveillance and defending the right to privacy across the world. We work with a network of organizations, and actually some of them are here across this table, DRF, CIS from India as well. Dataification is not a new problem, or actually data exploitation, like the way we like to call it at Privacy International. In a sense, the state has always been trying to collect data about its citizens to understand how they work, how they live, and in some cases for more sort of questionable reason, like suppressing dissent and understanding how citizens vote or are likely to act. Now, the moment you're born, actually, you're assigned an identity or assigned a gender, a name, the birth certificate is actually your first form of identity. The difference between the way it has always worked and the reality we're facing now is the amount of data that's being collected about you, because in a world of mass generation of data, it's no longer just your device that are producing data. It's no longer just your computer, your phone, but it's the society we live in. It's the cities we live in that are producing data. It's the public transport. It's the banks. every institutions you engage with in basically every walk of every step of your life, you will be confronted with this mass generation of data. And actually, more on smart cities, I've left some reports that Privacy International has recently been publishing at the entrance on smart cities. What the reality means is that the state is also getting into your homes, for example. So when we have systems of smart meters, for example, that are meant to control your energy use, to ensure that electricity is not wasted, for example. That means that the state knows, when you're going to bed, when you're home, and when you're not. When you're taking showers or bath, when you're using the kettle to brew tea, or if you're using a coffee machine. So there's all those information that were previously in the realm of your home that are now becoming information that both private companies and the states are getting access to. And again, I think one thing that's worth mentioning is that obviously those changes aren't advertised as, the states need greater access to your life. There's always sort of very good intention and very valid goal behind it, be it international development, aid. In the case of like smart meters, for example, the goal is the environment. It's just sort of the side effects mean that we are living in a world where, as I said, both governments and companies have unprecedented access to your private life. Now, the reality is that what it means is that people are losing control over the data. As I said, often they're not aware that the data is produced, but also they don't get to express consent, because it used to be that data protection was about like checking a box to say I consent to my data being shared. Obviously, when you live in a city where you're constantly placed under a form of surveillance, where your phone is constantly relaying data about you that the city is then using, there is no question of data. Literally, the simple fact of walking in the streets means you're generating data, whether you want it or not. But the other side to losing control beyond the question of consent is the fact that we don't know how our data are being used. And I think Anna touched a bit on this, but obviously we live in a society now where, what school your children are going to, the way the police are going to interact with you, the way you're going to be able to claim benefits or not, or be in a position to demand a loan. This is all regulated by the data that has been collected about you and what impression is being derived from the data you generate. So, for example, we know and I'm going to use an example from social media, actually, but it's important because to realize that it's not just what you post on social media, but a part of it is, for example, used in the UK to decide whether you're entitled to benefits. So if, for example, the job centers see you posting pictures of yourself on holiday or having fun, they might decide to withdraw your benefits. We've seen cases of that emerging just because you don't appear to be looking for a job. Or in Canada, we've seen example also of people getting their medical leave benefits also being withdrawn because they didn't look sick enough based on the pictures they were posting on social media. But it's not just what you post on social media, obviously. It could have very well to use with the way you use energy, the time you're on the internet. So those are all those factors. For example, again, there's the whole question of the financial sector and who's entitled to a loan and how much you should pay in interest rates. And so, for example, someone who call regularly their parents might be seen as more reliable. Someone who writes text message in full letters as opposed to using abbreviation might be seen again as more reliable and therefore more inclined to get a loan. So it's all these little things that we do without thinking, without realizing that this is the kind of data that will have decisive impact on the services we get in our society. And those are the services that we used to be able to get by having control over what we decided to share. Now, this talk also today is about social justice, and what's important to realize with data collection and dataification is the inequalities we are confronted to, because the poorer you are, the more surveilled you will be as well. And it's interesting to see how I mentioned benefits before, but how the systems of getting benefits or systems of control. Obviously, Anna mentioned this already, but there's also the whole question of refugees who are, at the moment, it often seems in the narrative around helping our refugees that we're hearing that it is about the data collection. It's about how much data we're going to be able to collect about them, gathering biometrics to understand who they are. And unfortunately, there is too little. There is too little time that's spent thinking about the alternative and thinking about whether this data is really necessary, and the question of also the right to privacy as a fundamental right that everyone should benefit to, even when you're not protected by a state. The last thing I want you to conclude with is the question of data protection laws, because obviously, again, I talk about the inequalities. In Europe, we now have the GDPR, but most countries still don't have access to data protection laws. And yes, I'll end on this.
Thank you. Yeah, lots of interesting and relevant points, I think, about data inequalities and how people may lose benefits because of what you said, because of data collection and so on. And yeah, go ahead.
Next is Malavika.
Going straight to the even more dystopian. Excellent. So I'm actually going to talk about the Chinese social credit system. And one of the quotes from the actual planning document about this was really chilling. In fact, I often sort of throw it out in conferences to ask people where it comes from. And usually people say Black Mirror. Or 1984 or something like that. And it's actually a really chilling quote. It's sort of about the whole motivation for doing it, and it says it's to allow the trustworthy to roam everywhere under heaven while making it hard for the discredited to take a single step. It's sort of like one of my favorite quotes from Gore Vidal, where he says, it's not enough that I succeed, my enemies must fail. It's very much in this sort of, we don't just reward good behavior, we really, really penalize bad behavior. And I think this is an experiment which is sort of at the absolute extreme of what a credit rating system looks like. And it could come from a good place. And I think that's sort of what I want to stress, that if you live in a country where you don't have a system for rating credit in other ways, and you suddenly try to do this overnight, this is what it might end up looking like, without the institutions, without the sort of knowledge around how you do this. What I find really interesting is it is about trust, but it's a very perverse idea of trust. It's not about you trusting the government or you trusting companies. It's about them trusting you. So it sort of upends this idea of how trust works, and it's not bidirectional. It's very much you're the enemy unless you prove yourself otherwise. It's also about reputation. And I think, again, it comes from a good idea where we've all asked in many ways, so many of the activities we do, so many of the good scores we get in certain systems, we don't really have portability around our data to actually take it to different places. This is an idea of portability in a very weird way because it's all encompassing. Everyone has access, all of the companies are sharing it. So your reputation actually exists everywhere in everything you do. So you don't even need to make it portable because everyone has access. I think it also raises a very interesting point about how everyone has to perform the labor not just of inclusion, but of proving they haven't done anything wrong, right? So you have to constantly assert in front of a system that's top-down that actually what you're doing is not deviant. It's not something that is a risk. But when everyone is being measured and 1.3 billion people are being rated and, ranked in so many finely grained ways, how do you keep asserting that actually everything you do is trustworthy when everything is measured? Roger Cremas, who's a really well-known Chinese scholar in Leiden, actually has described this as Yelp reviews with the nanny state watching over your shoulder. And I think this brings up another interesting point, which is it's really about the gamification of obedience and the normalization of surveillance. It's not, some sort of big brother kind of thing. It is the little brothers and the small, ways in which this can happen, where we are actively participating in this system, and everything we do governs our life chances, our opportunities, whether you can fly, whether you can actually get a loan, and it's not just based on what you do, it's based on what everyone in your social network does. So it's the kind of social graph that Mark Zuckerberg wanted to have, except they got there way more efficiently than he did. There's a great article in Wired I can refer you to if you want to read more. It's actually an excerpt from a book by Rachel Botsman, and she calls it the marriage between communist oversight and capitalist can-do. And again, I think as long as we're enthralled to the Silicon Valley narrative of, break things and fail faster, well, this is seriously broken and failing every day. And we speak with horror about a system like this because it's far away and it doesn't touch us. But I think we need to sort of bring back the fact that in very many ways, we're actually doing exactly the same thing every time we take an Uber or every time we sort of allow any of these platforms into our lives. This might be the sort of extreme on steroids version of, credit rating and scores, but in every little way, we're sort of implicit in this as well. So right now, I'll just describe very quickly how the scheme works and end. It is currently a pilot. It's supposed to be officially launched in 2020. So like another great scheme that is allegedly voluntary, the Indian biometric scheme, this is currently stated to be voluntary. It becomes mandatory in 2020. So currently there are pilots with 8 private companies, but they're the big private companies. So it's, China Rapid Finance, Ant Financial, which runs Sesame Credit, Alibaba, Alipay, WeChat. They're partnering with Didi, which is what Uber kind of caved to, the ride-sharing app. There's Baihe, which is a dating service. And actually, when I've talked to people about this and said, don't you find it weird that you're rated and that this comes into your dating lives? And young women in China have actually said to me, oh, no, we think it's fine because, of course I want the guy to be good looking, but I really care about his bank balance. I would like to know that before we date. That is important. So it's currently, I think, let me just tell you the features. It looks at 5 dimensions: credit history, behavioral habits, what is called sort of facilitation ability, which is like the ability to pay off your debts, whether you actually fulfill contracts, whether you fulfill your obligations, personal information of the kinds we've seen in so many other systems, and social networks. So kind of what the US wants to do when you enter borders right now. So these are the sort of 5 points of the Pentagon. It is a black box, as with most of these systems, surprise, surprise. The algorithms are actually treated as a trade secret by many of these companies, so good luck trying to get any visibility of how the secret sauce works. And of course, the blacklists that are generated through this are shared very freely with government. And it sort of begs the question of reciprocity. Are the governments also sharing their blacklists of, what prevents people from traveling? Or it's so finely grained, it prevents how much you can spend when you travel, whether you can get on a plane. It's really, so it gives you between 350 and 950 points that you earn through behavior. Sort of 600 and above is good. When you hit 600, you can get a sort of no-frills loan. When you get 950, you can, do all kinds of amazing things. And it is linked by what everybody around you does. So if your friend fails to pay off a loan, ding, your credit rating goes down. And it's also a really difficult project to investigate and research because nobody wants to talk about it because their social credit rating will go down the second they're actually discussing it and saying anything other than, oh my God, it's an amazing scheme. It's really helpful for social justice and for poor people. And you know, it's all about trust and sincerity, and it says it's going to forge a public opinion environment where keeping trust is glorious. And it'll strengthen sincerity in government affairs, and it's about commercial sincerity, social sincerity, and the construction of judicial credibility. So it's little things. Do you pay your electricity bill on time? But it does it completely devoid of context. So did you not pay your electricity bill because you'd been run over by a truck and were in hospital? Doesn't care, right? So did you use a card twice to go through the subway because you're a mother and a child and you have sort of one of those packed cards? Or were you actually committing fraud and trying to sort of, you know, get a free ride off the system? It's completely devoid of context. Something as innocuous as your shopping habits become a measure of character. And they say, literally, Sesame's technology director said, well, of course we judge people by the types of products we buy. Someone who plays video games for 10 hours a day, for example, would be considered an idle person. Well, that's pretty much all of us living on our computers all day. Someone who frequently buys diapers would be probably considered a parent, so they're likely to have a sense of responsibility. I know gamers who are responsible than most parents I've met, right? So like this is completely twisted in the way it sort of puts you in these very, very finely grained boxes. Sharing what Sesame Credit refers to as positive energy online gets you points. So if you say wonderful things about how well the economy is doing or how great the government is doing, it'll make your score go up. Reaching 650 points, you can rent a car without leaving a deposit. You can get faster check-in at hotels. You can get VIP lounges at the airport. You can get lower, sort of, you know, you have to produce fewer documents when you apply for a visa to go somewhere. So Roger calls it the bastard love child of a loyalty scheme. So it's all the loyalty schemes that we happily sign up to because we want frequent flyer miles, except it affects everything down to, you know, your chances that are way beyond just miles. It's about whether you can rent a house in a particular neighborhood, whether you're trustworthy to actually be, you know, a babysitter and those kinds of things. Someone actually said something interesting where he said, look, as someone Chinese, I know everything I do is tracked anyway. Wouldn't I rather be aware of the details of what's being monitored and learn how to abide by these rules and try and actually gamify it and sort of work around the system if I know what's being profiled and tracked? It's actually better than the kinds of invisible surveillance that I was already subjected to anyway. So maybe a system like this that actually surfaces these issues and creates a conversation about this is actually better. He says, would I rather live in ignorance and hope/wish/dream that personal privacy still exists and that our ruling bodies respect us enough not to take advantage, or do I actually want details about how the system works? So that's just a very, very quick canter through the system. Of course, it eventually will lead to this being gamed. There is already a huge black market in reputation and trust, as we've seen even in India with, you know, whole sort of thriving black market of fingerprints, of various ways to game Aadhaar, various ways that in which it can be manipulated. But also in the context of people who've been following the net neutrality debates, this system, if your credit scores are low, you'll have lower internet speeds. I mean, that, you know, it literally goes down to that level of influence on every single aspect of your life. And I think I'll end by saying it's sort of, you know, Luciano Floridi talks about how our online and offline has merged in ways that it creates what he calls an on-life. And I think this is sort of the absolutely extreme manifestation of an on-life, where everything you do online, offline is seamlessly merged, collated, tracked in a very, very finely grained way to create an overall profile of every single thing you do, literally like from cradle to grave. So cheerful times ahead.
Thank you very much for indeed the cheerful description of what's happening over there. Now I would
We'll see
like
if I
to
can
go-
get back into the country now, having said all of.
And it has been tracked there, don't worry. Sunil, it's your turn.
Thank you for giving me this opportunity. What I'm going to do is try and explain a paper by an academic written in 1983. The author of the academic is Gunther Tübner. The title of the paper is Responsive and Reflexive Elements in Modern Law. According to Tübner, law goes through 4 phases of development. The first phase is the repressive phase. The second phase is the autonomous phase. The third phase is the responsive phase. And the final phase is the reflexive phase. So basically, the repressive phase is during the medieval era, where the monarch was the law. During the autonomous phase, there was a rise of constitutions across the world, across multiple centuries, and the establishment of the independent judiciary. And the independent judiciary tempered the power of the monarch. The next phase is the responsive phase, when people realize that the high-level constitutional principles are insufficient to regulate the behavior of various actors that can cause harm. So if you're a single restaurant in New York City, you have several regulations when it comes to hygiene, trans fats, sodium, calories, etc., temperature of the beverage that you're serving. There's very detailed rulemaking. The other feature of the responsive phase is that the rulemaking is done consultatively. Stakeholders are consulted when the rules are produced. But the overall vision of the legal system is a top-down system. The trouble with the top-down system is if you want, you can launch a denial of service attack upon it, and then the system stops functioning. So during the last phase, which is the reflexive phase, the idea is that you fully take on board both complexity theory and systems theory, and you try and engineer self-regulating and auto-correcting systems without necessarily having to go up the command and control system. So I have no legal training in the law, and all of this didn't make a lot of sense to me when I read it. So let me give you the way I understood it. So there is a home, and the mother is the monarch, like most homes, and the father is the judge, and there are 2 siblings. And the project for justice is that they have to share cake. So during the repressive phase, the mother would cut the cake however she liked it, and you would just have to take the slice. You couldn't complain about the slice that you got. During the second phase, which is the autonomous phase, a constitution of cake is produced and stuck on the fridge. And the constitution says everybody is entitled to an equal slice of cake. And the mother would still cut the cake, and if you were unhappy with your slice of cake, you could appeal to the father, and the father would read the constitution and deliver justice. In the next phase, it is realized that cutting cake equally can be done across multiple axes, and if you cut the cake, for example, horizontally, only one child will get all the icing and the other child would get no icing, so they have a meeting on the table, dinner table, and they go through detailed rulemaking. For example, on some cakes there are rosettes, sugar rosettes, and each child wants an equal number of rosettes in their slice. So it's not just the high-level constitutional principles, but also highly detailed rulemaking in order to deliver justice. But the overall process of delivering justice is the same. You have to go to the courts in order to have justice. So in the final phase, what you really want to do is to eliminate the constitution, to eliminate, according to Tübner, eliminate the detailed rulemaking, eliminate the monarch and or executive and the judiciary, and you want to somehow engineer justice into the subsystem through process. So the solution there would be that one child would cut the cake and the other child gets to choose the first piece. So justice is delivered through the system. Now, Unfortunately, for us in the modern world, one child is Facebook and the other child is an ordinary citizen, and therefore we cannot be pure Tubinarians. We will always need the constitutional fallback. It's like one child is blind, so the other child cuts the cake and puts a shoe on the plate and gives it to the other child. So there are reasons why a pure reflexive solution will definitely fail. So what the private sector is telling us today is that in the big data moment, all the traditional privacy principles that we have talked about and that are articulated in data protection law, like the GDPR, are obsolete. That's what they tell us in India. So therefore, we should get rid of them. We should just decide big data is incompatible by design with consent and purpose limitation and data minimization and so on and so forth, and therefore just get rid of it and let's just accept the world in the post-big data moment. But what I would like to submit to you humbly in this room is that we need to reinvent it. We need to reinvent all these principles for the big data age. So how do we do it? And let me give you one example of a reflexive solution, and then I will shut up. So in India, 30% of the population is illiterate. Only 10% of the population knows English. So it's very difficult for, no matter what you have in the detailed rulemaking, it's very difficult for people to protect their own rights. So what is being considered currently is something called a layer of consent brokers. Now, currently, the consent brokers are intermediaries. So suppose you go to an insurance portal and you want to get competing bids from multiple insurance companies. The consent broker harvests both the personal information and your consent artifact and passes it on to the data controllers. They use the AI and big data analytics to produce personalized bids, and then the insurance portal gives you a comparative analysis, and then you get to choose. Unfortunately, the way the Indian law currently envisions this model is this infinite number of consent brokers, and consent brokers make money from the data controllers. So my suggestion is a simple fix. We need a competitive oligopoly of consent brokers, ideally like the UK identity brokers. So you have, for a population like India, 50 or 100 consent brokers. And we need a 1:1 relationship between data subjects and consent brokers. That means you can only choose one consent broker at a time. And like the Dutch system for those who give you advice on investments, you cannot, the intermediary cannot, or the agent cannot make commission from the investment funds. The agent can only make commission from the investor. So here, consent brokers will only be able to charge fees from the data subjects. They cannot charge fees from the data controllers. And therefore, market mechanisms will be used to ensure that your rights are protected. If you wanted to withdraw consent from multiple platforms, you just need to get in touch with your consent broker. If the consent broker knows that Equifax database has been breached, then the consent broker will act on your behalf because they would like to keep your business. If they don't protect your rights, you will take your business to another consent broker, and so on. So each of the privacy principles, if one tries to look at a reflexive solution, we can come up with some exciting new ideas, and this is what we are trying to propose in India. However, there should always be the fallback, which is if you're unhappy with the reflexive justice, then you must be able to approach a court, and you must be able to sic the criminal justice system upon the mega corporation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sunil. Everyone so far has been really nice, respecting the time. So now it's, we go all the way to Brazil with Joana. Please.
Okay. I have many questions to Sunil about the consent brokers. So, okay, I'll give you an overview on the topic about Brazil, talking a little bit about IDs and how the issue of identifying and have a unique identifier for citizens is being discussed in Brazil and connected to e-governance or the task of the government to provide services for citizens. So, so the question for an official digital identification started to emerge for citizens to access government services. In Brazil, we have many IDs, like we have CPF, which is the number that connects Brazilian citizens with the financial services. We have the national ID card that is issued and you can issue a different one if you change from state. So it's you can have like 2 national IDs now. Then you have the driver license and the electoral card, work permit. So those are all different numbers. The basics for you to have a contract or hire a service is the national ID and the CPF, the one that connects with financial services. So the government this year in May 2017 approved to change the situation, approve a unified registry for ID and to aggregate the CPF, the national ID and the electoral card. And so we are going to unify all those numbers. Very inspired by India. And the proposal is that it's going to happen until 2022. Besides many questions for unifying ID that emerge from India as well, there is another question that's about security and authentication of this. The law that proposed it summarized the security issues around the document as the security of the document will be ensured by using modern processes to keep the data in a chip on the card. So it doesn't say too much and it doesn't say how it's going to be shared and so on. We don't have any standard to talk about the register of citizens, and it's obscured the agreements of the data set flowings within government organizations. And one particular political issue on this is that this bill has also been proposed in partnership with the Electoral Court, which was recently involved in a scandal for sharing personal data of 141 million of Brazilians to Serasa Experian, which is a data broker. It is the Serasa is part of the Experian data broker framework, a private company that manages credit scoring of consumers in the country as well. And it's the Electoral Court is also the one that's pushing now for analyzing social networks for fake news during elections in partnership with the army and the intelligence agency. So this is the body that wants to centralize our IDs. Besides the Electoral Court, the Federal Revenue Agency it's known that Federal Revenue Agency tracks social media as well. So if you have been traveling and buying stuff and posting all your travels in Facebook, then they can check your revenue declaration and if it's compatible and so on and so forth. And then coming back to credit scoring. So I mentioned Serasa, this sharing of databases within the electoral court. It's the main data broker in the country, but we also have seen the emergence of other fintechs, and we don't know the origins of the database for them to do the credit scoring. We went to a fintech for purposes of storytelling, a project that we have called Shutdowns. We went to a fintech fair, and it's sold as a solution and very innovative, and it's going to include more people. So it's the same rhetorics of credit scoring, but and then we were like interviewing people. One of the guys, okay, what do you measure? And then he was like, for instance, if you are single woman, you probably have less credit because you don't have a husband, and you might go crazy shopping. So then you see the kind of values that are embedded in the evaluation that the fintechs are doing. And then we did a test. In Brazil, we still don't have a data protection bill, but we have an instrument that's called habeas data, so you can request people that have your data, what kind of data they have. So we asked Serasa, because one friend was denied credit, so we took this case and asked why, not only why, what was the score and how the score was composed, but then we couldn't have an answer using this instrument. And the judge didn't even understand. The judge understood that we were, because we used the habeas data and took it to the judiciary, and the judge understood that we were just asking for the score and why the credit was denied, but we were also asking how do you compose this score? So the judiciary didn't understand the issue. And then I think my time's done, but just to mention, before this trend on unified identification, using social networks for governmental purposes like federal revenue or electoral court, this change in the credit scoring system also towards beyond the databases that they were used to use, that were more related to your financial data. We also see there is also the trend. It's all sold as innovation, but then innovation is also operating in the cities. The concept is also sold for the smart cities hype, which particularly in Brazil and in Rio where I live mixed with the security issue. So banks, transportation systems are more and more asking for biometrics. In this discourse, it's more secure and it's innovative because of biometrics. And we also have no clarity about the standards, the security measures. We have even airlines using saying, you can check in with photos with facial recognition because it's modern, So there is also this trend. And this all is happening in a country that has no data comprehensive bill on data protection. It's an opportunity for us to reinvent some principles, discuss consent, but the political forces now in the country are not very favorable for good discussions on consent and pushing for innovative solutions on the data protection. So I wrap here.
Thank you very much, Joanna. Yet more gloomy stuff. As we set up for Sebastian, there's a couple of slides that you want to share with us. We have, so if you want to come to the stage. Oh, they're already set up, okay. But then shall we collect 2 questions before we go to the next speaker? Please, go ahead. If you can introduce yourself. Thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Cadu. I'm an Isaac Fellow and a Brazilian law student. Well, I'd like to point out something. First thing, the social Chinese credit score, actually mostly about credit scoring. Well, the financial institutions, they already do try to understand you before they get you a loan, and both by negative and positive scoring, negative and positive entries, and to know that you pay your debts and stuff like that. And I'm not sure if the problem is in the positive recorders, because, well, to know that you don't pay is something, but to know everything that you paid is another whole different idea, or if it's the extent, the scale of this positive recorder, because, well, institutions like that, they do need some kind of trust so that they can give you credit or not, and fomenting this kind of initiatives can actually do improve their credit, the loans and stuff like that, that could be quite good for most of the population that needs credits. And, well, this population is mostly those that, well, don't have money because they have to have access to credit to do stuff. So this is one question, if the positive as all is a bad thing, or if it's only the scale. I mean, social network looking is something that is quite bizarre for me, but, well, anyway. And about these consent brokers, I like to, well, I'm not sure if this should be the focus of a discussion, because truly, believing a consent broker, it's something that really sounds like I'm just centralizing all my information into one only actor, and this just doesn't sound right for me. I mean, I like to not to have every data of mine in one actor, and mostly, well, if it is to be all my data in one actor, and, well, I'm tired of hearing that the data is new oil, data is new gold, data is a new chocolate, or something like that. And if I'm trusting one actor, well, I think I'd rather trust some big actor than a small one, because, well, at least in Brazil, I saw a lot of judiciary claims about personal data and personal data disclosure mostly, and the judges, they do think that data disclosure is something that they can do in any kind of situation. And, well, these big actors, at least back in Brazil, Facebook and Google mostly, they've been quite, well, positive in not disclosing this kind of data, at least not in a first moment. Then eventually with the big diary fees, they end up giving them up, but, well, they try not to give, at least. So that's the 2 points about the consent brokers and about the credit scoring.
Okay, before we have a couple of very brief responses, any other kind of just couple of questions for clarification? Let's make it very brief because we have more contributions later. So just 1 sentence, brief questions. 1, 2, 3. Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Luisa. I'm Luisa Lobato. I'm a PhD student in Brazil, International Relations, and I would just like to call the attention to trends. I think that we should discuss further here is the use of biometrics to collect all this data. And in Brazil in particular, there is this initiative by the Superior Electoral Court to collect the fingerprint of people to the election. So I think this is a trend, and not only for this purpose, but to ensure, for example, security and other purposes. And the other is to look at private actors and companies as core actors in this process, because, I mean, we look always at the state, and of course the state is important. I mean, it has a huge apparatus, but most of these technologies and efforts, they begin with private companies, with solutions and technology. So I think it's another trend you should be looking at. Thank you.
Yeah, So, okay, and we had two more very brief points.
Sanya from Third World Network. My question was about the Chinese social credit scheme and how many Chinese are already in the pilot version. And I know it's hard to research, but whether you have any indications of the impact so far, like have people been denied access to essential services or anything like that? Thanks.
And Parminder at the point.
Yeah, thank you. I had a longer comment, but I'll keep it short at this point and come in later perhaps. So the question specifically is to an excellent presentation by Sunil. But also what happens with the kind of framework you have suggested, it assumes a very informed citizenry. And I'll tell you an example, because let's say we have these kind of consent brokers, and they, in countries like India where people are poor, start telling you that you will get a pressure cooker every second month if you allow a little more kind of easy sharing of your data. And people do not have that advanced knowledge of what sharing of data kind of harm that they could do to you. And they will say, well, a pressure cooker is more important. And they would go to those companies which are providing those kind of incentives. And that's where a collective comes into picture. I always give this example of wearing a helmet. You are supposed to take care of your head, but government enforces that you will have to wear a helmet or a seat belt because people, the incentive structures over individual behaviors are different. So I think between the reflexive part, which is very important, the responsive, we have to build a good system, political system. And we often in these discussions completely try to give up the political part of it. And that has to be clear. Not that you are doing it, but for you, the question was only the first part. And therefore, I'm saying that the political has to be claimed more. Thank you.
Very brief responses by Sunil and Malavika.
Should I go? Yeah, so to the gentleman from Brazil, what I should make clear is the third correction, which is the consent broker should not have any of your personal information. They only manage your consent artifacts. Who did you give consent to whom, for what? Yeah, that's all. They hold no other data. Sorry, that was my mistake. I did not make that clear. And to Parminder, the consent broker can only make money from the data subjects. Because they can only make money from the data subjects, they have no incentive to say, give data for a pressure cooker. Because nobody is going to give them money if they sell pressure cookers. So the economic incentive has been built to protect rights. And suppose, and in a good system, the consent brokers should also be NGOs. So like a microcredit consortium of women who are saving, they can be their own consent broker for representing the people. So it can be non-profits as well as consent brokers, not necessarily for-profits. So the economic incentive has to be designed to prevent any allegiance to the data controller, only allegiance to the data subject.
Okay,
Very quickly, I think the problem with to respond to the gentleman from Brazil, I think it's not just that they don't have an interest in knowing you and to actually help improve credit rating systems. I think the problem is in the merging between commercial data that has a sort of locus with financial incentives and completely innocuous social behavior that shouldn't affect your credit rating. So I think it's that sort of blurring of lines between what counts towards a credit score that I find problematic. And that's why I also said in the beginning that you can see why systems like this are helpful in countries where there is no other rating system. But I think it sort of starts to bleed into the territory of something that actually goes a little too far. I know a lot of people. One of my colleagues is based in Shanghai. He's very happy that he has a good credit score because he got a huge discount on his apartment when he looked for a nice place to move to. So there are people who are genuinely happy, and he's a foreigner. So no other system of credit rating would have been portable in a way that helped him to get, to be known by the system. So he's very happy with it. But there are also ways in which the fact that it's not transparent, I think, is a real problem, because if it's a genuine attempt to actually do just credit rating towards giving you loans to people who are trustworthy, why not make all the algorithms and all of the other data, the data points that are used to generate it, why not make that more transparent? Like We've got systems now where Experian will give you your credit scores, and you have ways to actually wipe out that and start again. And there are people who can actually advise you on how to improve your credit rating. When a system is opaque, you don't have the ability to even negotiate it or even correct the fact that some of the data may be extremely inaccurate. So I think it's that sort of black box that is a concern. But I think we're seeing with a lot of these systems, they are answers to a genuine market gap or a genuine social gap. But I think the terms on which you implement them really matter. So that was on that. In terms of
Very
the
briefly.
numbers, I don't have numbers to hand. I can help you get some. The Citizen Lab has been doing some research on that. But again, it's really hard to research. The only thing is there were applications for 8 more licenses for people to do more pilots, and the government has put that on hold for now, citing conflicts of interest and questions about the credibility of the organizations.
Okay, we have another example of the transparency of citizens, actually, with from Chile, by Sebastian Beck.
Thank you. Well, in this short intervention, I will explain 2 cases of certification on social life that in the fact has a lack of human rights and privacy perspective, being highly risky to the whole Chilean population. In the second term, I'm going to expose a few recommendations that can prevent this and move forward to a proper balance between human rights and an open government. The first case is the Cervel database. Cervel is our national electoral office, and in order to make accountability to the Chilean political process, they published the whole voter register. The characteristics of this voter register are the following ones. First, it is a register with all the people who vote in Chile. You can find every single voter, either with his name or ID number. And a webpage took this voter register and published. How it works, I'm going to show that is the webpage that published the voter register, and I did a little exercise, and I put the name of our president, Michelle Bachelet. Next slide, please. And then the name of our recently elected president, Sebastián Piñera. Well, in that, the results of this is that we have the complete name of our president with his ID number, with his legal sex, with his personal address, and where is the city that she lives. The next slide, please. The same thing. Next slide. No, the other one. Perfect. Then we have the same information of our recently elected president. So the consequences of this are obvious. There's a massive privacy breach to millions of people in Chile, including our president. It is a violation to gender identity and sexual rights because it only shows the legal sex without any concern of in gender identity. With your address, every single person can geolocalize you and use this information to do massive and personalized marketing. Bank industry can do redlining and bring or bring not loans. Can be used as segregation weapon, etc. Through this information, we can find out some other sensitive information. Next slide, please. With this ID number, I can. It is available the birth of certificate of birth. There is the certificate birth of our president, Michelle Bachelet. Even then, we can find the complete name of her parents, her mother and her parents. Next slide, please. You can also find the marriage certificate of our recently president. Here's her husband, her wife name, her ID number. Also, we can find the demonstration of matrimonial goods. So we can realize how is the implication of this. The second case is not necessarily shown anymore. So the second case I will want to explain to you is the lobby web platform. In law in Chile states the obligation to publish every single meeting or audience with a public authority. Because of this, our transparency agency in Chile runs the webpage infolobby.cl. this webpage, you can ask and search audience with public authorities and see and control every single audience between public authorities and citizens. Regarding the aforementioned, NGO Multitudes published a report that stated that 84.7% of the audience does not comply the law because the matters and issues of those meetings are not regulated by law. So the question here is, what are the content of those meetings and audience? A scanner of this situation revealed that the purposes and the motivation of these meetings and audience are several sensitive situations of ordinary citizens. This audience consisted in wealth situation, financial problems, racial and xenophobic episode, etc. And these situations are public to everyone who wants to surf this webpage. For example, I'm going to tell you a case where a citizen asked to the mayor of a little city in Chile called Chillán in these terms, quote, "The purposes of this audience is because I'm a single mother of 3 kids. My current couple was our only financial support, and he suffered a brain accident that left him with a great damage. We rent a little house, and until now, we are not capable to pay the rent. He did not have a contract, so it is impossible to get any insurance payment. I don't have money to feed my children, and I'm desperate. You are the authority of this beautiful town, and I'm begging you to receive me, to show some documents and ask for help." Quote. So this public policy exposed a critical situation of ordinary citizens without any concern of their privacy rights. Also, these databases can be crossed with other databases, as we already mentioned, to create very specific profiles. So what our Transparency Office say to this situation? They stated that they will publish this information, but they are not responsible of their content. So who is protect our privacy rights in this situation? Nobody knows. As NGO Datos Protegidos, we believe that it's possible to make so few recommendations here. First, it is mandatory to understand this public policy with a data protection perspective. We have to think data protection as the first step to build this kind of public policies. Until now, it is totally the opposite. Latin America and Chile in particular, we started to think these public policies with an open data perspective, but without any check and balance in privacy and data protection. In second term, there is not a clear understanding of our government that the personal data that they have does not mean public information. Chilean state understands that its personal data is by default public information, so they publish this without any concern, check, or balance of privacy rights. Personal data is public only if that information has a public interest, and whether pass a balancing test through norms, through guides, or other technical tools as anonymization. It is mandatory and urgent move forward in a parallel way between transparency and data protection. Last but not least, it requires a strategy in open data policies with a human rights and privacy perspective. That means to build a strategy to see how are we going to show this information of what is the purposes of this information, and if this information are going to violate or not human rights. The strategy has to be a dialogue between data protection principles and open data principles. How it produce this information, what are the purposes, if it's legal or not, if it's the treatment by other actors are going to respect or not human rights. In sum, open data and datafication have to promote participation and citizen strength, but that must also include a respect and promotion of human rights, particularly privacy. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. So we heard now a bunch of voices and perspectives on data collection and data as a form of governance and the implications for social justice from various civil society perspectives. We have two more responses to this in a way from government and a perspective on what this means perhaps on for internet governance. Then Andrew would like to give the floor to Lisa Vermeer from the Dutch government.
Thank you. Not too much pressure representing the government here. I think you touched upon a very important point from Chile, because it's a really challenge to find a way between transparency and using of open data and protection of information from a government perspective. So I'd like to continue the discussion about that later on, and looking forward to having your recommendations. My name is Lisa Vermeer. I work in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I'm responsible for the portfolio on human rights and internet, based in Human Rights Policy Department and International Cyber Policy Department. My personal information with policy making related to big data is, because of this position in the MFA, rather low. But I would like to share some of the examples, some examples that will show how people in government are thinking about these issues and what's going on in the Dutch government. It might maybe be a bit abstract in relation to the examples that have been shared before, so I apologize for that, but I still think it gives an interesting insight in what's happening within governments. Let me first state that government officials are in general very aware of the challenges that are put forward by the emergence of data, of these tremendous possibilities of collecting and using data, the possibilities it could have for good policy making. The challenge lies in, the risk lies in good intentions, I think, sometimes also naivete on the side of the government, and not being able to think through all consequences, but also the very fast speed of development of technology and possibilities that do not congregate with the very slow pace of thinking and policy making and law making. So it's really a challenge. My experience is that most of my colleagues in the government find this a very interesting challenge, but struggle on how to deal with it, especially because government policy and regulations are very impactful on people nationally, internationally. So the decisions you make have a lot of impact, lots of responsibility. It's an ongoing learning process if you look at it from a positive side. Let me illustrate shortly three different examples. First, in the Netherlands, we have been working on a new law on intelligence services. It has been accepted by both parliaments, and it will enter into force in May. But in the meantime, there will be a referendum on the law, because that had been asked for by collecting lots of signatures in society. So there's actually quite an exciting times ahead to have a referendum on something so complex as the law on intelligence services. This law, the creation of this law has been a very long process of thinking about how new needs in a new technological society have to be enforced, but also embedded in an oversight structure that is good, human rights respecting, and where intelligence services act, it's really on the fine balance between the mere existence of breaching human rights, what they do, and how you can still protect human rights and take into account proportionality, necessity, and all these very important principles of rule of law. I can say that this is a very long and very detailed and very meticulous process in the Dutch government. Let me just think about what's the most important thing to say about this. I think we can, if you have any questions on this, I will just dive into it later on, but I'll stick with this. The second example I'd like to share is that a Dutch advisory council, the WRR, has written a report on big data in use of big data for security. Let me check the name. It was published in 2016. This report has led, big data and security policies serving security, protecting freedom. So this report, basically very short, and I think the author wouldn't like me if I would really push it into one sentence, but it said that you have to assure respect for human rights and values in all phases of the use of big data, and it actually pointed at the fact that the Dutch government did quite a good job when you look at collecting of data, but then it hadn't really developed the right safeguards and the right framework and measures for the subsequent process with what you do with the data. So it's first the collection, but then it's the analysis. Then it's also, for example, deletion of data that you don't need. It's the use of data. It's decision making on the basis of these big data sets. The combination of data sets, all these things, it actually pointed at a shortcoming in thinking on this, which is, in my opinion, quite understandable, because the collection is the most important. It seems to be the most important, because it really connects to citizens doing their things that have been described by the former speakers in a very, very elaborate way. But then for the government, it's very important to have the right framework for what you do with the data and how you use it. So our government has endorsed these advices and is still doing ongoing work on how to deal with it. I'm not really very concerned with that team working on it, but I can say that this thinking has been spread throughout various branches of the Dutch government, not only security and police, etc. And it really pointed at the very important aspect that has been integrated in the thinking and policy-making practices now. The third instance I'd like to point out is another report by a Dutch institution. It's called the Rathenau Institute. This report, there was a report on human rights in the digital age, and then recently they also published a report that is on, it's called Urgent Upgrade, Protect Public Values in Our Digitized Society. So this institute is helping the Dutch government also to give ideas for new policy making. At this moment in the Ministry of Interior in the Netherlands, a ongoing discussion is ongoing on how to integrate thinking on human rights online in policy making processes. It's all very abstract, but what I really admire about the process is that they do it in a very consultative way with having discussions within the government, involving all kinds of people with all kinds of perspectives, ranging from media to foreign affairs to health, etc. They involve them in a intergovernmental discussion, but also with stakeholders from outside the government to shape policy processes on this, and it really surfaced to the political agenda. So I expect some interesting results. I think these, especially the last two examples, show that for governments it's very important to have external reports and external inputs to get things going. There's a lot of thinking, but you need the expertise that is in society, and often you also need parliamentarians asking for it, and then programs will speed up, policy making will speed up. And then maybe referring to the first example, an important aspect of the new law on intelligence services is that it will be evaluated in 2 years after it will go into force. because there's a lot of uncertainty. Will it work out, the things that we design as a government, the new policy structures, the new laws? Will it actually work out as we foreseen it because of this super fast speed of developments taking place? So I think in this world, evaluation of the impact of laws in a frank way is very important. Also, external input to policy-making process is very important, and maybe also a little bit of patience for governments. Yeah. Thank you. It's very clear.
Thank you very much. And we close with a few thoughts on what all this means for internet governance. No pressure. By Madeline Carr from UCL.
Okay, thank you, Arne and Stefania. Yes, just a very few quick thoughts as we race down to the final minutes of the session. I guess I was asked to kind of link this back to the issues of internet governance, and there were 2 points that I would make just very quickly, ways that I can see that this intersects. One is in the context of, internet governance is based around a few principles, and one of those is multi-stakeholderism. I would say that we can kind of look back and see a trajectory where internet governance began really in the, in the 80s and early 90s, looking predominantly at governing a network. And at that time, there was a small community, a pretty homogenous community of people involved in that. As devices became connected, and particularly personal devices became increasingly connected, we saw this understanding that more actors needed to be engaged in this. And I would say that now we're looking at not securing the network, not securing devices, but the security of individuals. And I hope that this emphasis on individual security will drive further multi-stakeholderism in this process. The second point that I just wanted to make very quickly was that just this plea for people who work in this space to remain engaged with the technical issues, because I would say that one of the fundamental changes that is happening now is the migration to IPv6. Well, it's been a long, long process and still has a long way to go, but the migration to IPv6 will have implications for privacy because of the expansion of the IP address bank. And I think that in the 80s and 90s, when internet governance was first getting off the ground, there were no policy people involved, there was no civil society, there were no privacy advocates engaged, and it didn't work out as well as maybe it could have. And I would say now we're looking at a similar situation where it's essential that people who are engaged in these issues are also engaged in the technical issues. And I'll just leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So this is, of course, an issue where we should now have the discussion on for the rest of the day, which unfortunately is not the case. We had to start a bit late because the room was occupied at the beginning, so we started a bit late, which is unfortunate, but also I think we just wanted to hear from a wide range of perspectives. We have unfortunately reached the end of our session, but I just thought at least those who spoke, those who were on the list as a panelist, are there any final thoughts from you on what you've heard?
Or what we can do?
Or what
looking
we can do?
More positively into the future, if possible?
I think one thing I'd like to say is we don't explore the role of alternatives enough. We do a lot of problem solving around what's wrong, what's broken, what's terrible about a system. But I think we don't spend as much time unpacking what that system was meant to solve and look at, is there a better way to actually solve that problem? So if lack of credit rating is an issue or lack of identification systems is an issue, can we actually spend a lot of time proposing more benign, better, more privacy protective versions of those systems that solve for that particular problem without the externalities that affect privacy and human rights on many other levels, and that don't have the social justice implications that these carry. So I think we often miss the fact that even the most draconian systems were meant to solve a genuine problem for poor people and people who are not counted in systems. And that's why you see a lot of them saying they actually find these systems useful because otherwise they were invisible to the state. So can we make them visible in ways that are empowering?
Other brief thoughts from anyone on what should be done in a one-sentence tweet or something?
I think public policies, when we start to work with data, I think it's very important to try to have all the perspective of that public policy. I congratulate the Dutch government that they have a lot of inputs to promote a public policy. It's not the case of Chile that they only public the information and data without any concern about other issues as human rights and privacy. So I think that is the way we have to move forward. I think that's all.
Well, there's lots to be. Yeah. Anyone else? No? Okay. Yeah. There's lots to be discussed. Maybe this is kind of a starting point more than an end point, hopefully. But I think we probably have to leave it here.
Yeah, and just a plug for the next session in room 26, there's something on fake news and content regulation, which is slightly different, but it's animated by the same people, so by the same good intentions. So if you want to follow us there, you're very welcome. Otherwise, enjoy the last day of the IGF and hopefully have a nice Christmas break. Thank you for coming. And thank you for the help in the room here.
Thank you also.
Rush to the next. Thank you. There were no questions I got, right?
No, we didn't.
So we have to go to the next.
Yeah.
I have to rush to the next thing because it's unfortunately back to back. It's 24. Thank you so much for coming. You're welcome. Yeah, it's always back here.
Yeah, with that active, yeah. I'm also really close to Becky Gathings.
Oh, yeah. So Becky's still there.
Yeah.
So we are going to have more time. I'm sorry, I will run over. Starting at 5 minutes.
Hey, morning. How are you? So you're going to call me signature after transcript? I know that after, because he's going to talk about competition propaganda. So mine has a long Morning. How are you? I think we're going to have to spread out. Yeah. Where should I send you?
I could be on the side. It's fine.
We didn't meet yesterday. We're in a session, yeah.
Good morning, Mishi. Could you help me with how you pronounce it?
I'm going to be the online moderator for the 1040
I'll do my best.
session. Yes, I'm here for helping you with the technical. Okay, is this a computer that I use?
You can use it also.
Okay, I didn't bring a computer. I did not bring a computer. Okay.
We will try to use this.
Okay.
Do we have presentation for this session?
No PowerPoints, no.
No PowerPoint, okay. Do we have online participants that want to speak?
No.
No?
They're all here.
So we have just audience here.
Just audience, yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
The lady from
Parminder? This one is just for the caption and for the presentations, if we have any. And this one is for online participation.
Okay. Can I sit there? Is that possible? Do you need to use it?
Yes, I should write to them, but also good morning. I can bring it closer.
Okay.
Like this, it's okay?
Okay.
How are you doing?
Yeah, good, good.
Good. Did you go to any of the events yesterday?
I was having a dinner and I was sorry, I had to go to HEC parties.
I didn't go either.
You did?
Yeah.
There were so many other parties.
There's the GNI thing, the Biometric thing, there's Chinese coalitions that were doing some things.
It's a lot, yes.
Also, the other ways that you use this partial law that you have, like to figure much more detail out. If you maybe know other cases. Okay, I will.
Was there another session?
Before this.
You kicked them out?
Yes. Not very democratic. No, they were done. They were done.
Hello.
Yeah, actually, could you sit over on this side? It'll be easier for people to see you. The secret weapon. I'm a little intimidated. Still endangered, I think.
Already. I know it's hard to say that and those kind of men are the scariest. I'm glad I'm sitting between you two. You're our buffer, you're our Geneva.
She's a good one.
Good
morning.
Yeah, that was another session.
1 or 2 minutes, but I think we should get started pretty quickly because we have a limited amount of time. Good morning, everyone. I think that we should go ahead and get started. We have a really great panel, and we only have an hour. So I want to go ahead and get things started and make sure that there's time for questions and discussion afterward. So this panel is the Distributed Denial of Democracy: Threats to Democratic Processes Online. This is organized by the National Democratic Institute, the Center for International Media Assistance, and the Center for International Private Enterprise. And the way that this panel is going to work is I'm going to open it up with a brief statement. I'm going to introduce our 6 panelists. Each of them are going to have 5 minutes to discuss the issue that they're here to talk about from their region. And then we're going to open it up to questions and answers from the audience here and also from the audience online. And my name is Daniel O'Malley, and I'm from the Center for International Media Assistance. So let's go ahead and get started. The distributed denial of democracy refers to the online use of multiple actors or channels to deny citizens access to or to interrupt the flow of legitimate political discourse, thereby undermining democratic culture and practice. Thus, while a distributed denial of service attack, a DDoS attack, takes down a specific website, a distributed denial of democracy attack attempts to remove certain voices from what appears to be an open and participatory dialogue. As the prevalence of internet-based media platforms has grown, so has online activity by actors and individuals that seek to silence or exclude voices online. Anti-democratic actors have created innovative new techniques that turn the attributes of the internet against open institutions, harnessing hyperpartisanship, filter bubbles, and age-old human biases accelerated with content stolen by criminals or outright disinformation to erode trust in institutions and increase social strife. These efforts, which are often coordinated and well-resourced, are frequently harder to detect and have the overall effect of undermining civic engagement. The challenges to democracy online are not the product of governments alone. For example, at the Center for International Media Assistance, where I work, we have noted how social media platforms are undermining the business model that supports independent media and the circulation of high-quality news and information. This weakens the broader media ecosystem and also undermines democracy, which depends on a robust free press. In a similar fashion, online violence against politically active women is much more distributed and has the ultimate effect of silencing voices of women and discouraging their participation in public dialogue. We need to find ways to make sure that the internet fulfills its initial promise of connecting people and enabling them to become more active participants in the democratic process. Ensuring that the future of the internet empowers universal human rights and democratic values will require cooperation from government policymakers, the private sector, and civil society. This is why it is so important for us to discuss democracy and the internet at places like the IGF that are multi-stakeholder. And I would now like to briefly introduce this panel, which offers a variety of different perspectives from the private sector, from media, civil society activists, among others. And I'm really looking forward to their comments on the faces that they're seeing to democratic processes online and the ways that we need to work together to make sure that every region, every sector is heard in these debates. So I'm going to start. To my right is Hanan Boujemi. She is a senior tech policy expert with more than a decade of experience in the economic and legal aspects of internet policy and governance. And she is also the co-chair of the IGF's Dynamic Coalition on Internet Rights and Principles. And she's originally from Morocco, but she's now living in the UK. Next to her is Mishi Chowdhury. She's the legal director of the Software Freedom Law Center, based in New Delhi. She consults with and advises businesses in the US, Europe, India, China, and Korea. She's a member of the Bar Council of Delhi, licensed to appear before the Supreme Court in India, all the state high courts in India, and also in the state of New York. And next to her is Jahan Ara, who is the president of PASHA, the Pakistan Software Houses Association, which is the representative trade body for IT and information technology-enabled services businesses in Pakistan. She is an entrepreneur and social activist and a strong propagator of extending the power and use of information and communication technologies beyond pure traditional businesses to empower and enable communities. Next to her is Marta Roldos. She's an Ecuadorian journalist and anti-corruption activist. She has been deputy of the National Congress, and she was also a member of the Ecuadorian Constituent Assembly. And she is currently the executive director of Fundación Mil Hojas, which is an organization committed to defending democracy and human rights in Ecuador. And next to Marta is Chris Doughton, who is the Chief Innovation Officer at the National Democratic Institute. Chris has designed and implemented programs in dozens of countries which apply integrated, context-appropriate technology to reach more citizens, track political processes, and improve organizing capabilities. And last but not least is Matt Chesson, who is a diplomat and technologist who has served in some of the most challenging assignments in the US Foreign Service. Matt has also led implementation of an open source crowd working platform called Open Opportunities, And his particular expertise here that he's going to be sharing with us is how artificial intelligence enhances computational propaganda. So now I'm going to ask the speakers to give 5-minute interventions, and we're going to start with Marta.
Hi, I would talk to you briefly about the experience in Ecuador. In Ecuador, for us, internet was like the last frontier. We had an authoritarian regime, we had a gag law and a communication law that was a censorship law, and then most of the investigative journalism moved to the internet in order to be able to keep publishing, investigating, and publishing. The problem is that the repression moved to the internet too by the government. Since we are not China, and our government didn't have the capacity to put up Great Wall, and they didn't want that too because they didn't want to be labeled as a dictatorship. So they did things more intelligently, and they devised, we got all the sort of things that now we are seeing around the world. We got troll centers, Putin-style troll centers. We got bots. We got a lot of attacks against women journalists in general, but women journalists in particular. We got also a lot of propaganda. In the case of Ecuador, it was curious because the fake news came from the government, not from the civil society. And the government used all these devices to spread fake news. But we also are like a very successful experience of overcoming these attempts of the government. Like in 2011, 2012, it was people got afraid to talk on the social media, and then we got a lot of participants, mainly investigative journalist platforms, the Lawyers Association. People got into the media, important players got into the media to counteract the discourse. So when you have, maybe you teach the people, you teach the public to discriminate against contents. And then you have a very normal person asking someone who was putting content on the social media, what is your source? Please put your source, or are you sure about that? And then you have people that have learned in these years to discriminate this kind of content. So they try to keep disinformation campaigns, but now people knows better. Maybe you can do it for a day, but like the next day, the disinformation is contested by informant people. But that is because, you know, mainly players got into the social media. You have MPs in social media, you have lawyers in social media, you have a lot of human rights activists, feminists, all in social media. And we began to counteract also the attacks, namely, a woman teacher who was head of the teachers union, her nude photographs were posted by people related to these government troll centers to defamate her. But all the women, like 5 minutes after that, all the feminists, not only feminists, journalists, all people was pouring support towards her and were condemning what they were doing. So it was very effective. Now we are in a kind of transition in Ecuador. We were able to still to keep publishing the news about corruption. We were able to push an human rights agenda because all the main players got into the social media too. So that's Ecuadorian experience. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Marta. And I think we'll now turn to Jihan, who can tell us about some of the experiences that they're having in Pakistan.
Thank you. So in Pakistan, since I represent the private sector, I would like to first own up to the fact that until about 9-10 years ago, the IT sector in Pakistan was very insular. We only engaged with government on policy in a very civilized fashion. You know, we would write to them or we would hold meetings with them. We wouldn't be very aggressive. We thought that was the work of activists. And until in 2007, when the government tried to push through the cybercrime bill, it's when we woke up. And we realized that we would have to do something. And I think one of the smartest things we did was we used the multi-stakeholder approach, and we connected with activists, with media organizations, and with all stakeholders whom we knew were involved in policy making. So that way, you know, we got together, we had meetings, we shared what our concerns were, and we approached the government and lawmakers with one voice. So that made us a lot stronger. And that group over the years has become stronger and has engaged with parliamentarians, with all stakeholders together. And I think that makes it a very powerful group. And that's how democracy is supposed to function in any case. So some of the things that have been happening as far as Pakistan is concerned is, other than the cybercrime bill, which we continue to be engaged in with government, they have finally made it into an act. And there are still some areas of concern, although having engaged with them, we have been able to push through some of our concerns, and it is not as draconian as it was when they first drafted it. But, you know, multiple takedowns of, you know, platforms, mobile services being shut down under the guise of security, those kind of things continue to happen. And that affects communication. It also affects essential services like emergency services. When you can't work on your mobile, your number is inoperative, you cannot contact emergency services, you can't contact services like Uber, and multiple services now that citizens, business people all depend on a regular basis. So those are things that we continue to engage with government on. And I think that's something that we will have to make sure that they understand. I think one of the things that I have seen myself is that there are always champions within parliamentary groups and policymakers whom, if you engage with them and educate them, because sometimes it is ignorance that results in some of the worst policies that come through. If you engage with them, educate them, then they become your champions. And we've held press conferences with activists, with politicians and media to make sure that the message gets across, that people understand what it is we're fighting and that it's not all a lot of noise. Activists, of course, have, whether it's activists who are younger, who have now engaged on social media, or whether it is women activists especially who've been engaging with government for the last 30 years. They're not that powerful as far as social media, internet, and all that is concerned, but the younger people are now engaging with them and making sure their voices are also heard on the internet. Many of these women do not want to be openly visible on social media or the internet simply because they feel threatened. So, you know, it is our responsibility as technologists as well as the activists amongst us who can teach them how to keep themselves safe and secure on the internet. So we've all been working together, and I think that's resulted in a very powerful stance that we've been able to take. Of course, the challenges continue, and we will have to continue to make sure that any policies that are made or any threats to privacy, there's no data protection law. Platforms who sometimes tend to be very compliant with the government simply because they want to continue to make money. Also, telecom providers whose licenses depend on the government, sharing of our data with anybody and everybody, those kind of things are things that concern us. But I'm just grateful that the private sector, the IT sector has woken up and is now actually actively engaged. Many of the IT business people are now more activists than you would, that you would even, you would expect from people who were otherwise in suits and only engaged with government in a very professional manner. So this is something that's happening in Pakistan, and that's what I wanted to share.
Great, thank you. And I think that's a really powerful story of kind of different sectors working together, as you said. Once you spoke in a united voice, people listened, and that you were able to find champions in government, which is really important in these cases. I'm going to now turn to Mishi, who's going to talk a little bit about what the problems that she's been working on and seeing in India.
Thank you. Just for clarification, I'm the legal director of Software Freedom Law Center based out of New York. I am the president and founding director of SFLC.in. I'm going to be talking only about my work in India. I think I usually find that problems now, no matter which jurisdiction you are talking about, there perhaps is a common thread which runs through. So I could just shut up and say, you already heard it and you will hear it. But I'm going to just concentrate on a little bit of a different sliver here in the same light. I think it's true that the political parties have figured out what is the power of internet to shape the discourse. I also think that primetime television takes its cues nowadays from what's going on in social media, and therefore the entire discussion about what is important and what should be highlighted has now become a part of the cacophony which the internet feeds into. The topic itself, the distributed denial of democracy, I think the problem is itself may be too large for the solution, because it's not just the net that's at fault, but I think we as human race as well, because we're the people who actually make the internet. We all started and we wanted freedom of every brain to learn, but we also have a lot of intermediate objectives, and then we get distracted. We have intermediate objectives of winning elections to making more money and various other things. The power of the net for shaping politics or misshaping of politics, I think the governments are finding it very hard to have a consistent focus on the human effect on the net as much as they've already figured out the political or the economic effect of it. Where I come from right now, shutdowns, which is the complete blanket shutdowns of the network connection, is the all or nothing response of the states to the problems they think cannot be solved. Shutdowns, of course, induce censorship, they increase despotism, but they don't actually solve the problem of this internet, which is now something which we have created. It's a blunderbuster. It suits the state power sometimes, but in no regards help what the society actually need. It does provide people with an experience of the limitation of distraction, which is good for like maybe 10 minutes again. My work and my organization's work is cataloged on something called the Internet Shutdowns Tracker. You can find it on internetshutdowns.in. It shows that in India, the shutting down of the net is the constant locating problem, and it's a system. It's broken over here, it's broken over there, it's always broken in Kashmir. It's really an example of the way in which the government has yet to figure out how it can help the society deal with the net. It's mostly about aggression and hostility, which is what the government's usual explanation is. It's about rumor control. It's about avoidance of communal violence, national security. It's never about how do we use government's authority to help create a better environment. It's definitely the crudest form of harm limitation from their end. Just in terms of numbers, we've had 65 internet shutdowns in India in 2017 alone. 25 times it was killed in the state of Jammu and Kashmir. For 3 months, from June 18 to September 18th, Darjeeling, which is a place in East India, it was completely covered in darkness. Our shutdown tracker also goes and tracks about whether it was mobile shutdown or was the fixed line internet shutdown. Most developing countries, the access to internet comes through mobile network. 94.3% of Indians who are online connect to mobile and not fixed line internet. So once the mobile network goes down, that means their connection to internet is totally snipped. We track stories also because all those statistics are important, but after all, then they become just numbers, and personal stories do tell you what's really going on. People are not able to pay their loans, their monthly installments. Students are not able to apply to universities because now it's only one place, and if they have to apply to universities which are not in the same part as they live in, then if there's no internet and no fixed line or mobile internet, it's difficult for them to run their regular life. And if it's not there for 3 months, like in Darjeeling, then you can only imagine that after high school, if something which is an equivalent of an SAT and you're not able to take it because there's just no network connection, how does it impact your future in comparison to the rest of the country which is actually applying? We also got certain stories. All of these are cataloged on our website, where surgeons said that there's now a move to move everything online, and a lot of times they're not able to access their own patients' data before they can go and continue with some kind of surgeries which are scheduled. So it's small businesses now rely on communication services such as WhatsApp. People take their orders, deliver their orders using these services, and once they have no access to it, these are people who do not have a lot of capital which they can rely on when there is no network connection. We do appreciate, having worked with the government, to understand that the policeman's job is maintenance of public law and order on the ground. And if they're doing it right, they're doing it without much collateral damage. That's what one at least expects usually. Generally speaking, the net shutdown imposes a fair amount of collateral damage. That's the conclusion we have come up with. And the policeman's tool in this case are extremely limited, and the fact that they have this one, it means it's going to be grotesquely overused. Not because that there is any justification for this, but it's like, well, to every hammer, every problem is a nail. And if you only have one hammer, so you shut down the net for whatever good it will bring to you. I also particularly think that the comprehensive surveillance which now exists in order to enable advertising has become the political economy of the net. So much so that now it's worth for platform companies to be able to carry people's packets at their own expense in return for the right of being able to look into what people are talking. Various examples in Free Basics by Facebook still exist in many other countries, and how this works in view of democracy is not only now a developing country problem, and we are watching it play out in different parts of the world where suddenly it has caught everybody's attention. I also think that there's an overbalancing in this direction, because when there are political troll armies of one political party trying to drown the discourse, then the promise of the net that it's going to democratize discussion and everybody will have a chance to talk takes a very different color of its own. And when women and when other particular groups, which are vulnerable groups, 2-3 years ago started raising a problem that we are being really harassed and this is going beyond control, a lot of platforms and a lot of people were said, well, if you don't like it, just get off the platform or develop a thicker skin. But that's only just telling you what is coming, and now we live in that era when there's not just vulnerable people or women who do have opinions because they are equally citizens, sometimes smarter, which can only be my belief, but when they are kept off some kind of discussions, you know that there will be everybody else who will face the same thing. So I think that's where we are in most of the places.
Great, thank you, Mishi. And I like the thing that you pointed out there at the end, that these are issues that are global and not just in specific countries. Sometimes we see some of the issues like the free basics debate in India, in those regions, but these are really global issues that we're all trying to grapple with. So, and I think that's a really important point to highlight. I'm now going to turn to Chris Doughton from NDI.
Great. Thanks, Dan. Hi, folks. Great to be here. At NDI, we work a lot on improving citizen access to political processes, and particularly around elections. And so we've seen a huge level of impact on the political conversations and discussions that take place at those most sensitive of pivot points in the history of a country, which is an election, where things can really swing dramatically based on a sometimes very, very small change in outcome. So, you know, with the rise of a lot of these challenges to democracy online, whether it's disinformation or trolling or so on, people will often poo-poo this a little bit, say, well, you know, this is not new. Mark Twain talked about how rumors go all the way around the world while the truth is still putting on its shoes. Or Thomas Jefferson ran a whole series of newspapers that did stuff that any of us would define as fake news, scurrilous attacks on John Adams. So that may be true, but something that I think that really is new and different is in the field of computational propaganda that's using computers to accelerate or increase the flow of targeted messaging online. Something that I think is new is the problem that we refer to as manufactured consensus. So, you know, there's a number of things that are true and challenging when it comes to disinformation and political communications online. You know, it turns out that Mishi referred a bit to human psychology here. You know, it turns out that like consistency of messaging isn't important. It doesn't matter how many times you get hit with variants on different messages that are false or incorrect. That will still serve to undermine a narrative. You know, we see a lot of attacks on what had been gatekeepers of truth, or kind of authorities or elites that had been before sort of people who helped us establish what was correct or what was not. That whole process is being undermined. But what we think is, I think in some ways most disruptive, is this challenge of the tapping into humans' herd instincts. We're social animals, we're communal animals, and so there's a huge amount of implicit pressure just built into our nature to kind of go along with what seems to be the kind of the common opinion of everything. And so that's something that can be deeply problematic online, thanks to the problems of bots and computational propaganda. If a message is relayed via a whole bunch of different messengers, or what we think are different messengers, and we see that popping up in our news feeds or in our Twitter streams or even our messaging apps over and over, then it will appear to us as though that is what everybody thinks. Now, that may in fact not be in the least bit true. This is something that we've seen a lot in technology with crowdsourcing in general. Anything that people tend to use volume as a proxy for accuracy or intent. One of my favorite examples is when there was an open survey of where Justin Bieber should do his next concert. Pyongyang was the selection of the masses, not because that's where most of Justin Bieber's fans wanted him to go, but enough other people jumped on it. The same sort of thing can be used for much less humorous purposes by trying to convince people that something that's completely untrue is the case, or that they should vote a certain way, or refrain from voting at all because everybody is equally corrupt and problematic, and the whole democratic system can be thereby undermined. You know, we see this playing out globally, whether it's things like Peña bots in Mexico, the extraordinarily effective use of Facebook Messenger in the Philippines with President Duterte, and in many other countries around the developed and developing world, we're seeing this take place. So it's hard to know what the answer to some of this is. I think Marta mentioned how in Ecuador people have become more informed, more intelligent consumers. And so there is certainly a literacy question to this. People can be a little bit more aware. It also may be that the switch to messaging applications may actually help reduce some of these threats. When we're not in the kind of the open public spheres of Twitter, Facebook, it may be that some of these smaller conversations that are more typically between people that you actually do know may be less impacted by this. We would certainly advocate for more of a, when possible, labeling bots online to try and help people distinguish what is legitimate conversation from actual organic humans to what is being pushed or propagated. But if the genie is truly out of the bottle and there's very little that can be done to stem the flow of computational propaganda via bots, we may be in a weird world where democracy advocates have to start training who we consider the good guys, pro-democratic forces, on how to build and use their own bots, and that we may end up in a world where the bots are all dueling it out for democracy. So leave it at that. Look forward to questions later.
Great. Thank you, Chris. And Matt, now you're going to talk a little bit about artificial intelligence, which is kind of like the next level of these bot armies that Chris was mentioning.
Yep, thank you very much. My work has focused on the intersection of artificial intelligence and computational propaganda and how we combat disinformation online. My government, the United States, is still trying to fully understand this phenomenon. And I want to talk about some of the research that I've done on looking at some of these emerging AI technologies and how they can impact computational propaganda. But first, I just want to put in a word for preserving the freedom of expression and avoiding censorship. The United States government promotes a vision for the internet that is interoperable, reliable, secure, and open. And a big part of that openness is this freedom of expression. We believe that people have the same rights online as they do offline. And the internet's got a tremendous amount of value to us from our ability to freely associate with each other, share ideas, express ideas and opinions, and to do that free of interference or censorship. And so we don't want to utilize, we don't want to take this problem of disinformation online and use it as a reason to censor free speech online. So that being said, I just want to play on a couple of things that Chris had already mentioned here. So what are folks doing with some of these technology tools? Doxing and bullying is very common, where they'll release personal information about people in an attempt to keep them quiet, and then they use these armies of bots basically to reinforce those messages and those threats against people. They'll do hashtag spamming is another common one. Activists are trying to organize via hashtag. They'll just spam that hashtag with a bunch of garbage information so that the activists can't actually communicate with each other or organize. Most of these techniques violate platform terms of service, so they're not technically illegal, but they do violate Twitter, Facebook, and other social media platforms' terms of service. And then, what Chris mentioned was this use of networks of fake social media accounts. These are accounts that impersonate real people, and then they try and manufacture this consensus. So these are sort of the challenges that we're facing and that we're dealing with. But we can't be judging the actual speech that's coming out, because that gets us into the realm of determining truth from fiction. What we really need to focus on are the bad actors, the bad intentions, and then the bad effects that they're having on communication online. So now let's talk about some of the emerging artificial intelligence technologies that are going to impact computational propaganda. And also, to be clear on this, the technologies by themselves are not inherently bad. There's nothing inherently bad about these technologies. They will be used for a lot of good, but they can be used for some of these malicious purposes, and we need to be aware of what these are. Very quickly, what is artificial intelligence? We're not talking about sentient computers here. AI is popularly thought of as machines that exhibit intelligence, and that definition's fine. Better definition is to think about it like biology or chemistry. It's a field of problems to solve that deal with pattern recognition, autonomy, perception, recognition, learning, and decision-making. So it's a better way to think about it like that. It's a little more inclusive, and it gets us out of this realm of thinking about what Elon Musk and Stephen Hawking talk about. And so let's talk about some of these technologies. So chatbots are increasingly able to have human-like conversations. So Microsoft's Xiaoice is probably the most popular one. It was a Weibo top influencer. People have proclaimed love for Xiaoice. They tell it they wish she was a real girl and they want to marry her. So people develop these very close relationships with these chatbots, and they're only going to get better and better at having conversations that basically emulate human beings. AI systems are getting really good at creating, dynamically creating content. So books and screenplays, they create some really good visual art and some really good music now. What's a little more concerning to me is actually the sort of these audio and video manipulation technologies. You might have seen some of these where you can sort of do this real-time manipulation of real videos online. There's one out of Stanford where they manipulate Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin's face in a YouTube video, and then there's some that basically dynamically generate speeches that Obama never made. So these tools are going to generate all of this content and basically create this sort of pliable reality where they're modifying and shaping events in real time and creating fake events. You have affective computing and psychometric profiling. These tools are really good at figuring out what people's emotions are and communicating to them in an emotional way, and also figuring out what people's personalities are, their sexual orientation, political leanings. You can figure out all of these things with just a very few pieces of data, and then use it to create personalized propaganda and disinformation. These are digital tools, so once you create one, it's very easy to then create many more of them. They learn, so they can optimize their behavior, and they can be working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So while we're still trying to shape responses to things, they can be out shaping narratives. And so we're moving to this era where we're going to shift from this bot-driven computational propaganda that are just pushing out human-generated content to this autonomous computational propaganda that's pushing out this machine-driven content. And that's going to complicate some of these existing problems we're seeing with computational propaganda. Also, just interesting sort of cultural note, you know, we're going to see a lot more of these machine-driven accounts communicating with each other and sharing information with each other. And so we're going to have other intelligences moving into the online communication space. And that's a big unknown as to how that's going to work and what the impacts of that are going to be on human communication online. So I wrote a paper about this, and it's called The MADCOM Future. It was published with the Atlantic Council if you want to read more about this. I'm a big proponent of artificial intelligence. It's going to be probably one of the most beneficial technologies that mankind's ever produced. But we do need to be aware of this coming wave of machine-driven communication, and we want to make sure that it doesn't interfere with free expression online. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Matt. And now we're going to turn to Hanan, whose expertise at global internet governance forums, working on internet rights and principles, is one of the reasons why we have her on this panel, because we've just heard a number of different issues from government trolling, surveillance in Pakistan, the blunt use of shutdowns in India, also the comprehensive surveillance as a business model, computational propaganda, bots. I mean, we've heard about a lot of different things that are all going to shape how people engage in the future and how people participate in democratic processes. What are some of the things that we can do, and where might this go in the space of internet governance?
Okay, well, I'm not sure I have some magical, solutions to all this, but we've heard a lot about, shutdowns, which are the major issue in the last maybe 2 years or 3 years. There are other, problems, with platforms in general. Is the mass production of content that is pushed through different channels, and I call them content platforms because I don't want to talk anymore about, social media. So we need to understand that phenomenon, at various levels. So it's not only political. These contents, they literally shape public opinion, and in certain instances, they basically change the narrative, and we all do have to worry about that. But how do we solve all this? I mean, I was very, pleased to hear all the stories and all the case studies from Pakistan, and how the private sector turned to be an efficient actor to affect, what's happening at the local level, and open channels with governments. So you can address a little bit of these issues since they're concerned with what's happening. I mean, they are almost the extended arm of the government. So when shutdowns happen, we need to understand that, operators get sometimes direct orders from, I don't know, from the Ministry of Defense, or it depends on the country. So how do we solve all this? So our work at the coalition is specifically concentrating on using what we call soft norms, common, framework that we can define at the global level to address these things. Why? Because we think that regulation is usually slow to adapt to technology, and also hampers, in many instances, democratic values in general. That's why we focus on principles, because we thought that we can adopt a holistic view of what society needs, what are the core values that we all need to subscribe to in order to have a democratic space, whether offline or online. Now, what's happening in technology is worrying beyond the shutdowns. I mean, we do have a lot of decisions now which affects how people are going to connect to the internet. And I think what's happening vis-a-vis the network neutrality discussion in North America in general is considered like it's a turning point actually in our field. And I think we were fighting for democratic countries for a long time to be established. I think the next 10 years will be probably focusing on how we can democratize the internet. I expect this topic to be a top item in the agenda of our discussions here in Policy Fora. So the Internet Rights and Principle Coalition have developed a set of principles, 10 principles, based on a charter that was conceived a few years back in the context of the IGF. And it was a collaborative work which included actors from various disciplines: legal, government, private sector, activists, and civil society in general. The agreement was to design principles that are easy enough to digest for the normal public, but it turned out that the principles were actually handy even for governments. So unexpectedly, we managed to influence some of the important policy processes in different countries, be it in New Zealand, Italy, in different countries which use the principles as a baseline to design their own policies. I think a lot of progressive governments see a point in establishing a common framework of values, core values that we all can base on to do our work on the internet. So I think the work that we've done along 9 or 10 years now has evolved a lot, and we're very pleased to see other organizations defining the value of our achievements and basing on it, so we can move forward, because there is a lot happening. 10 years ago there was no shutdowns, but now we see the importance of stipulating how important it is to preserve these principles for democratic values, and that applies to many fields. And I think the missing discussion in this forum was about media, and I point that out. So we don't have a media practitioner group specialized in highlighting all the issues that comes with media development or media in general. I think we probably should start a separate track at the IGF so we can look at all the issues specific to the media sector, and how we can link it to what's happening in the content industry, powered by technology and powered by the internet. So there is a lot happening, and myself, I'm still learning what's going on in the media sector. So I think if we agree to maybe combine our work to integrate the set of values we've been working on to encompass other sectors like media, that will be great. And I hope other countries or other organizations will adopt these principles and try to promote them. We were contacted by some Russian fellows in this meeting. Somebody sent me an email yesterday to say that, oh, your charter is translated to Russian, and he handed it to me. I don't know him, like he just came across our work, and they made a commentary as well on certain sections that we need probably to adapt to the Russian context, because we keep, adding, points to the charter. So, I mean, I think we think it's great, we really appreciate, people going through the details of the charter and finding a value in doing it. So as I said earlier, I think we should focus more on probably agreeing on a set of values and not rely entirely 100% on regulation to make things happen, because we know how things can be slow at the legal side. Thank you.
Great, thank you, and and thank you to all of our panelists. What we're going to do now is we're going to open up the floor to questions. So we're going to take. Do we have any questions from the online space?
No, unfortunately we don't.
Okay, so we're going to take 3 questions from the floor, and then we're going to let our panel respond to that. So if anyone has a question, please raise your hand now. Yes.
I have a quick and short question. First of all, it's been a fantastic panel, and I really liked all the speakers. But just to the last speaker. My name's Joanna Bryson. I'm a professor of artificial intelligence. And I also work at the Princeton Center for Information Technology Policy, so maybe I can work with some of you there. But I'm at the University of Bath. Okay, long introduction, short question. Henning, you said that I agree with you that regulation can be slow and principles are really useful in getting the soft law out. But in your first introduction, you said that regulation can actually be anti-democratic. And I think of law as ultimately we do want to capture the good ideas and push it forward. So and also I think most of artificial intelligence does happen already in a regulated space, and that what we need to do is improve the regulation because it's not built to purpose as things change. So I always think of regulation as something we also need to, as a parallel process, catch up. So why do you say it's actually bad for democracy?
And hold that thought. We'll take a couple more.
Yes, Boris Engelson, a local journalist freelance. And since I have attended only half the session, my question will be at best half sensible. If you look for Grameen Bank or Mohammed Yunus online, you will get easily hundreds of articles praising microcredit, Grameen Bank, and Mohammed Yunus. If you have any doubts, then it will take half a day or even more to find some documented article analyzing beyond just the slogans, the realities of microcredit. What do I mean by that? I mean that in a world of not information poverty, but information excess, censorship and manipulation go this way. It is why some cliches are plenty and some truths are hidden. And this mirrors, to a large extent, the own prejudices of the public. And this leads me to the second point, is that in the case of Ecuador, what makes things all the more difficult is that Ecuador government has a good image with the civil society, rightly or wrongly. They can hide behind the socially progressive, etc., rhetorics. And so it will be very difficult to convince the civil society of some truth because they will feel that they are stabbing their own bodies in the back.
Great, thank you. And do we have one more question from the floor and another intervention? Okay, I'll turn it over to Hanan first, and then we'll open up the floor to the second question, which is a good one.
Oh, thank you, Daniel. Okay, so yeah, well, I said that on purpose. You know what? Because law is interpreted in different ways according to the context. And when I mentioned that regulation can be slow to adapt and it hampers in certain contexts democratic values, I meant it because I worked a lot in the Middle East, and I can assure you that implemented legislation specific to the internet is not necessarily reflecting, the democratic values we believe in. As an example, freedom of expression. So that kind of statement is maybe, general enough, but at the same time specific, because we can see that, happening in certain contexts. I know that law means something completely different in the US, but in other regions, it's a completely different story.
Great, thank you. And now the second question about excessive information as a form of manipulation or censorship, situation in Ecuador. Anyone?
I would like to address both questions. Sorry, sometimes I would like to be able to speak Spanish because I would do it faster. But the thing is, I think something that you said a minute ago is that we need to think how to foster good journalism. Because part of the disinformation thing is that you need to foster good journalism. No? You need to be able to find ways to convince people maybe to raise money like this multi-stakeholder way of raise money for good projects of journalism. Because that's the question, you know. To do good journalism takes time. It took us, Mil Hojas, 6 months to investigate how our highways were building in Ecuador, because it was the main propaganda of our government, you know. Now we have highways. And then we find that some of our highways cost 10 times or to 100 times more than a kilometer in the in Europe. So but it took to put 2 persons 6 months to go through database and misinformation. So it takes time. It costs, even if you charge little and you have underpaid journalists, it costs time and it costs a lot of effort, and people both need to value that. And in the Ecuadorian case, gratefully, it's not the case anymore about our government. They are in the last government, Correa, has a very low popularity, but it was in a heyday. And when he was in his heyday, the ones who were pushing for the truth, we were persecuted. I have friends that went to jail. I have indigenous people, leaders that went to jail just for protesting. So it's very revolutionary to give your the jungle to the Chinese mine companies. But I don't know, I think it's Twain that said that you cannot fool everybody all the time. You can fool somebody sometimes, but you cannot fool everybody all the time. But it has a cost, because until you have the possibility of fight back, of organized people. And it's very funny because in Ecuador we work like in several platforms at the same time. So I'm feminist too. So I have a huge group of feminist friends, and we have a WhatsApp group. And when some of them knew that another friend of us was being attacked by the government, and they were posting her nude photograph on Twitter and Facebook, we all organized through WhatsApp to act in Twitter and Facebook. So it takes a lot of effort and it takes a lot of organizing, but it happens. Now in Ecuador we have had our shutdowns, but they don't say that they are shut down. They say, you know, the cable broke. Say, where is the inform? Where is the report? No report. So, and when you come from countries like ours, sometimes you are afraid of laws that may be well-intentioned, that can curtail freedom of expression, because freedom of expression is your last recourse. At least in Ecuador we said, at least we have the derecho de pataleo, the kicking back, that crying, that's our last resource for help, and it helps, because when you cry, someone helps. Thank you.
So on this concept of sort of this volume of information, I mean, this is one of the tactics that malicious actors use to spread disinformation. And it's not just with bots. They'll actually create dozens and dozens of web pages that look like local NGOs, they look like regional newspapers, they look like experts, but they're actually replicating the same disinformation over and over again. And part of that is to game the algorithms that basically push things up to trending topics, or game the Google search engine or things like that. And the platforms are always, it's always a struggle. They're trying to work on these things. But what they're actually trying to do is capture people into this ecosystem of disinformation. So they lure people in with emotionally pleasing information, and then they capture them in what looks like a rich media environment where they see a lot of web pages replicating the same information, and then a lot of social media accounts that are saying the same thing. But those are all being run sort of by the same actors or the same network of disinformation actors. And so, I think Chris mentioned, so we might need to use some of the same tools to counteract this. Now, we should never use disinformation, and we should never use unattributed accounts. That's just going to contribute to the problem. But a lot of the same tools can be used to actually direct streams of truthful information at these vulnerable and targeted populations to make sure that there's no gap that these malicious actors can actually fill. So I think that's something that we all need to think about, is how can we actually make sure that we use technology in a positive, proactive way to address some of these malicious actors.
Great. Mishi, you had something you want to say?
The various things I want to say, but this particular thing, I'm very interested, and also I think, Chris, you made a point earlier about if we move to messaging apps, perhaps that will have some impact. In my work in different places, what I've watched is once organized power figures out how to use certain tools, we are basically just catching up and cataloging things. Right now, I have watched how preparation for certain kind of elections is done. It's not to the conscious mind, it's to the subconscious mind. And if I can continue to get WhatsApp forwards, which is very common if you see in Latin America, in Africa, Southeast Asia, various other places, messages which are tailored to exactly what my issue is, in my dialect, and exactly what the messaging should be, is now constantly being used. So, and one of the issues these are real, like when there's a threat of communal violence and you speak to a policeman on the ground, which I've done because of internet shutdowns, is that they say, you guys want end-to-end encryption in WhatsApp, but then you don't want, when we have 1,000 people, thousands and thousands of people gathering on the ground, and they're going to disrupt the public law and order, what do we do? It's a very difficult answer at that time as a person who likes free speech and expression to give. About rule of law, I do work in two very different jurisdictions. I think one of the problems internet has done is that everybody believes people have the First Amendment right of the US Constitution. Most constitutions don't give us First Amendment rights. It's a free speech and expression with restrictions creeping in various other ways. So I would urge everybody, because this happens to me as a lawyer all the time for last several years, that you don't have the US First Amendment. You have a different limit. All your laws will go and face that limit, and that's how it would become. And the interesting thing, Hanan was saying that rule of law means different things in different jurisdictions, it can be unpacked in a lot of ways. One idea I just want to put out is it's very unpopular, let me say, is that I would like to restore asynchronicity. If people would stop syncing people's time with internet's time, perhaps we will have a little more peace. It's like the silence we don't even let the silence begin to permeate our thinking again. Nobody does their computing standing still. I do not understand what is the really extremely urgent email you are going to send in that line getting into this building, which you are holding up the entire line, but you have forgotten because you're so much into your phone. But you are just scrolling through shopping stuff. You can do it elsewhere. But people send emails, people send important information in elevators, walking on the road, and everywhere else. If people could do their computing standing still, preferably using a wire, because we've all now understood how secure Wi-Fi's are, perhaps we will have a little more sanity restored in the system. And we don't have to get instant gratification for everything. And it's like, it used to be that I think, therefore I am, but now it's like I'm tracked, therefore I am, or I tweet or Instagram, therefore I am. Otherwise, did that thing even happen? Well,
misunderstood. I mean, okay. Yeah,
so
I have a quick one. A point for the lady.
We have to wrap up soon, so let's.
Yeah, well, I'm not anti-regulation because I just checked now my Twitter account and it's flooded, with me anti-regulation. So obviously that's not what I said. So just to make that clear.
May I just add? I think, Rishi, you're not going to get this because in countries like yours and mine, where there are huge populations of young people, instant gratification is what they're looking for. So the latest technologies are being used to communicate either very important messages or very, very unimportant messages all the time. And this is going to continue. We are not going to be able to stop it. We might want sanity and peace. They do not.
Jahan, I totally agree about the fact you are observing, but I am more optimistic. I think it's very fascinating. If you've not grown up on fixed line, and you're a young person or an old person, and this is your first computer, it is very fascinating.
Yeah.
It is really very attractive. When I look at this thing and there's video on demand, there are pictures on demand, I can reach anybody, it's very fascinating. But time, over 2-3 years, when I actually begin to wrap my head around what this means and what it does, and if there is enough education about the impact of this on us as human race is talked more and more, I do think that people will understand. It's the same thing, privacy is dead. Privacy is only for Mark Zuckerberg. But today, privacy is for all of us. At least we want it, we demand it, even if we are not given, but we still demand it. So I think if the conversation started to say and discuss a little bit more, I know my idea is unpopular, and that's why you're right.
No, it's not unpopular. I'm just saying it may be unrealistic in the short term.
Short
term, it may happen in the long term.
Let's play the long game.
Thank you. This has been a great panel. I really apologize that we've only had 1 hour to talk about these issues. I think it's good that we've ended on some positive notes from Mishi, who's much more optimistic. And I think we also heard some optimism. And so is Jahan. Also, from Martha, too, though, the way that the Internet is enabling her feminist group to organize and mobilize. So, we're not here to just say that the Internet is bad and evil and a threat. It's about we need to marshal different social actors together to make sure that it remains a positive place for everyone. And I want to plug something that kind of piggybacking on Hanan's work on the Internet Rights and Principles Coalition, that our institutions, the National Democratic Institute, the Center for International Media Assistance, and Center for International Private Enterprise are working on, which is a principles framework for democratic processes. And we're kind of talking about these very issues and what these would look like in practice for people so that we can take that to civil society activists, to some governments that, just need a little bit of education. And so